All right. Happy Wednesday. I am messing with the listener and viewer folks these past couple of weeks. I'm just messing with people. The days and the times are off, all this stuff. So we're back with another Learning Tech Talks. It's Wednesday in the morning, which is very different than the usual time. But hey, everybody knows the time that it usually is. But we're still exploring the landscape of learning tech. Although today we're not exploring tech solutions. We're going to be talking about it's going to be a combination of things. So I'm not going to spoil it because we're going to get into it. But I'm joined by Stacia Garr, and she's the co-founder and principal analyst. Is that your official title at RedThread, Stacia?
That is right. Yes.
All right. See, nailed it. We're off to a good start. We're off to a good start on this. And she's a fellow ed tech, HR tech enthusiast. In fact, this week you were on two lists. I get to actually speak with an official HR tech influencer today. So you've been on the awards list this week.
Yeah, a couple of actually three, if you can believe it. It was
three of them. I only saw the two.
Yeah. So two tech ones and one diversity and inclusion one. So
okay,
which is cool because I work at the intersection of a number of different things. So it's cool to be on multiple.
There you go. Well, yeah. So there was HR executive. I saw the DEI one. What was this second HR tech one?
It was Hum HR. I can't remember but just another group, but 70 influencers you should follow. So if people don't know what to do with those lists, because I remember I used to be like, what is this and why does what I use them for is I then go follow those people because I figure if someone thinks they're pretty smart, they're gonna make me smarter. So I don't follow them. So that's how to use them for those who don't know.
So there you go. That's how to use those lists. So if you're not following Stacia already, then that's what you should do right now is go follow her on LinkedIn. Because the work you guys are all doing over at RedThread, I'm a big fan. I follow the stuff you put out because it is great in terms of keeping up with the industry. So let's talk a little bit though, before we get into it, because we're going to talk about some of that stuff. You got two big research studies coming out. So we're going to hit on that topic. We will inevitably hit on the big topic of hybrid work as you're traveling now. So this kind of goes back to this. Things are kind of starting to open up, but now it's clamping back down and who knows what's going to happen. By the way, for those who are, I completely skipped this part. For those who are watching, comment in, let me know where you are. Stacia, you're traveling, that is the spoiler that we said there. Where are you right now?
Yeah, I am in Napa. It's a rough place to travel to. So
I'm sorry. That's really unfortunate. How long are you there for then? Because I saw yesterday you were at an event. You were going to be live tweeting some details.
So that's where I am. So it's I'm here just till today. So it's a 2-day event. And then next week I'm in both Austin and then Atlanta, all in a 4-day period. So I feel like I'm diving back in on the deep end.
And are you going, you traveling around for conferences or are you going to events? What's on your agenda?
Yeah, so these are mostly events, so vendor events. So right now I'm at Eightfold, the talent acquisition, talent management skills platform. And then next week I'm at Perceptics, and then I'm going to WorkHuman. And then the week after that, Danny's actually at Unleash for several days. So if anybody wants to meet up with her, she's there. She'll probably kill me for telling everybody, but And then actually you and I were talking about this in the pre-show, but then Danny and I are getting together. First time we're seeing each other, co-founders, in 2.5 years. So
that's awesome. So it's funny kind of going through the conference stuff because I've seen all the conference stuff popping up. So now you're signing Danny up. So Danny, if you watch or listen to this, all the people are going to just bombard you at Unleash because I know there's a lot of people going to that. That'll be so 2.5 years, because that was my question when you said the two of you were going to get together. And I'm like, oh, when was the last time you saw each other? 2.5 years. I'm like, wow. Okay. That's crazy.
It is crazy. She's had a baby since then. I mean, she could have had multiple babies since then, and I wouldn't know.
You would know, but
well, I would know.
That's true. That's true. You would know. Well, so let's talk a little bit, because some folks might be. I'm familiar with you and Danny and RedThread, but other folks may not be. So just to kind of set the tone, because we're going to be talking about, the title is about insights and research and things like this. So we are going to talk about some of the stuff that's coming out of research. But for folks who may not know, when you tell people I'm the co-founder of RedThread Research, and they go, that sounds interesting, like research into what? How do you describe to people what you all do over there?
Yeah, I'd say that we are a human capital research analyst and advisory firm. And then obviously, we cover a range of areas. So Danny, and for those who don't know, Danny Johnson is my co-founder. And so she focuses specifically on the things you tend to focus on, Christopher. So learning and career and internal mobility and then all the technologies that support that. I'm kind of on the other side of the house, which is more around talent management, talent strategy, people analytics, DEIB, employee engagement and experience, and how all those things weave together. So we do all those things. We're a research membership, so folks can buy access to the membership. We even have individual memberships, which is different than my alma mater. So I was at Person by Deloitte before this for 8 years, and then was at CEB, now CEB Gartner. And one of the things that used to drive me crazy about those places is we'd have these, students or people who are in smaller business come and say, "Hey, I love what you're writing. I'd like to be able to access it." And we'd be like, "Well, that will be $50,000, please. Thank you." And nobody could do that. And it's like, what? The people who work with those companies deserve great research, information, insight, just as much as somebody who works at GE. And so when we launched RedThread, one of the things we did is we put it, someone's got to pay for the research. We have to, someone has to enable us to do the work. But we put in an individual membership so that, someone who just wants to improve their development and learn what's happening in the industry can access just like someone at a big company. So.
Okay. Well, and I've got to say, I really appreciate the fact that you do that, because having worked at a lot of big companies, if you work at a big company, you sometimes take that stuff for granted. You're like, oh, well, we have access to this and that and whatever, and you don't think really much about it. But yeah, if you're just, even in a functional group, sometimes as a functional group, you don't even know that the corporate team has access to some of this stuff. Yeah. That's the other thing. But yeah, if you try and reach out and go, all right, I'd really like to get access to some of these industry insights and things like that. Like you said, it's like, oh, I wasn't really planning for like that much, of a cost associated with it. So I think the fact you've democratized that, and you guys put out a ton of stuff just open to folks as well. I mean, I get a regular sea of information from you all on different research studies you do or insights into things. So, okay. Go for it.
Oh, I was just going to say, so yeah, one of the things that we do, for instance, we do like an infographic for every major study that we make available for free. I mean, so obviously it's not the in-depth, analysis that we have in there, but at least it gives people something, some of the key statistics and all that. And sometimes it's all folks need. Hopefully they get benefit from the other stuff as well and want to be members. But ultimately, like, we're in this to try and make the world a better place by helping people make work a better place. And so, that's our ultimate goal.
Well, and your infographics, what's funny is you bring that up, because I think I had a post that just blew up, and it was your infographic from the LinkedIn Learning research study that you did on skills for L&D professionals that blew up. So those infographics, they're a popular thing. So here's a follow-up question to this on the research, because I'd love your take on this, because you did such a good job explaining what do you do with influencer lists, or how do you think about influencer lists? So now I'm going to put you on the spot on this one. When it comes to research, I am curious your perspective on how people can make the most of that, because I think sometimes when it comes to some of this research, there is, and I posted about this yesterday, there is so much stuff coming out, hitting people from all different sides in terms of, well, there's this trend, or here's the data on this. It can feel overwhelming. And I have no doubt that there are folks that go, I honestly am not really sure what to do with it, which sometimes then that leads to, you take the infographic, you throw it in one of your presentations and go, and here it is. And you kind of hope it sticks. But how do you recommend when people, deal with research that they actually make the most of it? Because I think that is an area that is an opportunity area for a lot of folks on the practitioner side. They may have access to this stuff at their fingertips, but they may not necessarily know what they're dealing with.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple points. One is they don't necessarily just default to what you just mentioned, which is being a consumer of research. But I think to the extent that you can be a part of the process and the learning that comes. So that's actually one of the things we did with RedThread that is fundamentally different than any of the organizations I was at before, and I think really anybody else, is that we try to bring in practitioners from the very beginning. So like we launch a new research study and we say like, this is the press, this is what we think we're going to ask about. These are the hypotheses. Of like, what are we doing? Like, you and I were talking earlier about how sometimes, you see people write things and say things and you're like, well, if you had any idea what it's like, you would not even be saying that, right? And so as researchers, we need that voice, but also then practitioners, I think, need to be involved in some of these discussions because it helps you see like, oh, other people are thinking about it this way, like even just from the problem statement, right? Like, because if you don't ask good questions, you're not going to get good answers. So I would encourage folks to first think about, is there ways that I can be involved in the learning process of research? Because once you get to the end, you're going to have a much better understanding of what's happening. And I recognize that everyone is busy, so I'm like you're actually in the trenches, but having conversations with people who are at the early side, I think can be helpful. But then to go directly at your question of, hey, if you see a research study, what do I do with this? Particularly around trends. Like, to be honest, sometimes the trends reports are some of my least favorite to write. I know that's like being a heretic, right? Because we're supposed to, but there is some element of like, well, okay, so like stuff's happening, but what am I supposed to do with it? And what I would suggest people do is, one, you look at the trends and you say, okay, in what ways are we potentially responding to this, or is this something that will hit us kind of flat-footed? So if you think about what we were writing 3-5 years, we were writing about digitization. We were writing about how you were going to have a more mobile workforce, how people are going to be. It's actually really funny. Danny and I we didn't write it, but we had on the docket of things we were going to write for 2020 in 2019. The employee experience for digital nomads. Like that was a report we were planning to write in 2019, and then the world blew up and right. And if people,
a little things changed.
A few things changed there. But if people had been, prepared for being digital nomads, right, their transition to fully remote work would have been a lot easier, and all this stuff. So I think the question is, are we preparing for these things? And is question one. And the question two is, and maybe it's the other way around, but how does this impact us as a business? Because sometimes, like if you're in a heavily unionized manufacturing organization, some of the things that we write about, like realistically, the timeline for that impacting you is really long. And so that may just not be something that's quite as relevant. So maybe actually that's the first question. Is this even relevant to us? But then second, if it is, are we preparing for this? Are we thinking through it? And then third is, going, once you've decided it is, like, okay, what are kind of the tactical elements? And the first one almost always is getting other people on board with your point of view. So saying, hey, I just read this great RedThread article on blah. I think it would benefit us in X, Y, and Z ways. Would you have a look? And sharing that information with your team and aligning on vision.
Okay. So I'll add some commentary to that, because I think I love the fact that we took some time. That wasn't on our agenda either, but I just thought, what? This is one of the things that I see really causing a lot of disruption for folks is they aren't really sure what to do about it. And I love the point that you brought up, being involved in it. So easy. It's easy to kind of put things off, but I don't have time. I'm too busy doing things. And this is how you actually get better and more efficient, is by getting involved in this stuff, because you do learn from other people. You hear other situations and go, wait a minute, you build that network of connections. You end up solving a lot of problems. So while it seems like, oh, that's a lot to do on top of what I'm already doing, it's like, well, but this is actually helping you get your work done. So participating in it versus being an armchair quarterback and going, well, that's not realistic. Well, so then be part of it and help shape it and then bring that conversation. So I love that you brought that up. But the other one too, with the trends piece, is really important, because I do think, I'm the same way. Like people, I always get asked like, what's the latest trend in learn tech? And you're like, I hesitate to even say it, because then as soon as I do, people think that should be my priority. And that, like you said, that's not how to think about research or trends. Is, okay, I just kind of shift my priorities or set my priorities based on whatever the trends are. If that's what you're doing, you're using the research wrong. It's really, like you said, it's that litmus test of, hey, if there's a trend on this report and you're going, I've never even thought about that, that's probably a problem. You should probably go, am I familiar with this? Is this something we're thinking about as part of our strategy? Does it impact us? Like you said, is this something we go, our business isn't even there yet and probably won't be for a while? But and I think that's where people get that change fatigue, is every time they see a new industry research report come out, they think it's a constant, oh, now we got to go reprioritize because my priority list doesn't match this. And it's like, no, that's not it. I think your example of the digital nomad is a great one. Like, had you been thinking about it in 2018, in 2020, you might have been like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that point about not necessarily reprioritizing is really important, because look, if your strategy should be based off of what your business is trying to do and what your business is trying to achieve. And so if you're thinking through, okay, this is our strategy, I would say that the trends are almost, a sideways or a filter over which to lay. So like, you have a strategy for whatever, filling people. Sorry, it is early here, to be fair.
It is, I know.
But let's say you have a certain strategy. Let's just say that. And then you would say, okay, am I thinking about skills in the context of this strategy?
Yes.
Am I thinking about, how we're going to be, if we're back in 2019, digitalizing our capabilities? Are we thinking about all of these things? But it doesn't necessarily say that this is the wrong thing that you're prioritizing. More like I said, like that filter. The other thing I want to comment on, and I'm not trying to be like too self-promotional here, but consider the stores, right? So like an organization like RedThread is not trying to, like, we are a research organization, and that is our business. Our business is not a big like consulting thing. We do some consulting, but it's very limited. It's more like, honestly, Christopher, it's more like people who we are good friends with come to us and say, we want you to. Can
you help us?
Yeah, can you help us? And as you know, we often very intentionally pass it off. We're like, no, we're not going to do that. Like, here's 3 other great people. And usually when we do consulting, it's when they come back and say, no, we want you to do the consulting.
Yeah, I don't think you're hearing us. I'm not asking for help in this area. I'm saying I want your help.
Yes. And then we're like, okay, all right, we'll help you. But the point being, like, that is not our bread and butter. Our bread and butter is doing research. But organizations for whom research is effectively marketing, you just need to be aware of the source of those materials, because they are probably encouraging you to reprioritize so that they can get in there and help you with a new prioritized list. So just be thoughtful about your source.
No, and I think this is a fair point to bring up on this, because if you're a practitioner and you've been a practitioner in the space, you may not be aware of all this stuff. And it's no fault on anybody. It's just, you may not be aware of how much of this stuff that you may be seeing is influenced by, this is a sponsored, or it's a type of thing where it's like, well, there's an agenda behind it. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. I think that's one of the other things is sometimes it gets demonized, like, oh, well, this is sponsored, so ignore it. No. But then again, I think your filter lens is a good example where you say, so just filter it through that and say, okay, knowing that the agenda that the next hot big tech platform is yada, yada, sponsored by said big tech platform, there's a vested interest in them saying this is the next hottest trend because it directly ties to that. Now, does that mean it's not a trend and that you shouldn't consider it? No, but just recognize that, do you just the Pied Piper, follow that? Well, just be careful with that. And I think it's a very valid call out, because a lot of people just don't understand how some of this stuff works.
Yeah, for sure. And also I think you need to feel like you have some trust in the source. So like, for instance, we license our work, right? So we did a report a number of years ago called skills versus competencies. What's the deal? And having a bit of irreverence is an important part of.
Oh, you have to. It's the only way you can make it.
It's the only way. But the folks over at Workday license that. And for us, nobody influences what we write. No one has an influence on what we do. But they were like, okay, we think the market needs to know a bit more about this. We're gonna, we're gonna distribute it to our prospects and other folks, and and all the rest of that. So, but the thing is like, again, it comes back to who is doing the writing and the source. Like when we go into any of those conversations, I will say, like, you will have no input over this. Are you cool with licensing it?
Right.
And some people are like, oh, and I'm like, okay, cool. Like there's plenty of other places that'll do that. So that's fine. But just you need to know who's doing the work, or even more so. I'm not speaking, again, to your point, there's valid work being done, but consulting firms, consulting firms put out, all sorts of good data, but very few will put out something that they could not also then consult on and deliver that service to you. So it's just, just be aware.
No, and I think the awareness is just the key. Again, it's just like, buying a vehicle. Like, it's best to be an informed buyer so that when you see the things, you can put it through that filter and go, okay, is it still valid? Like, I can still take insights from it and go, okay, but I also recognize there may be an agenda behind it that I just need to filter and temper things down with that. There's a question that came up that I am going to ask, but I think the example that I'll kind of flesh out, that going back to how this conversation started with on the trends piece, is a good example of one that I saw recently that created all this kind of debate as it grew, was immersive tech. Right? It was popping on the list. Now you've seen, this is the next hottest thing in L&D is immersive tech type of a thing. And I've seen people, and I've been in conversations where people have asked, so should we reprioritize things to focus on immersive? And again, that's an example where I say, no, maybe. My answer is maybe, because I'm like, what are you trying to do right now? Are you doing some heavy simulation skill development where practical application's a problem? If it is, and you're saying, have we considered using a different kind of technology to try this? It may be a good opportunity to say, well, we haven't considered it. Maybe now's the time to try it. If you're saying we're not doing any of those things, then you might say, okay, no, it's not. And maybe we should be thinking about, as we get there, do we know enough about this technology? Do we know how it might work? Are we familiar with players in the space who are doing it? Yeah, but don't shift your priorities. And what I see sometimes is people then end up arguing over, well, immersive tech isn't the next hottest trend. Oh, I think it is. And you're like, that's not the point. The point is the tech is reaching a state of maturity where it can go mainstream. Are you considering that as a factor? And there isn't a right or wrong answer in terms of yes or no. It's, well, what are you prioritizing right now? And then figure out, maybe there's a need to pivot, maybe there's not.
Yeah, and I think another example of that has been, everyone's been AI, machine learning, all the rest of that. And I think that there is incredible potential with AI and machine learning, but again, it's something you need to know, and you need to understand what the use case is and how it might be important or not important. So, there, in all honesty, for everyone who says that they're doing AI or machine learning, I'd say there's maybe 10% who are actually doing it. Like if you pull back, the hood and look,
like legit, if you legitimately dug into what their algorithms are, it's actual AI.
It's actual AI. But the thing is to be honest, it's not necessarily a problem per se, because if the solution does not require, if the problem you're trying to solve does not require AI or ML, and these folks are saying, well, nobody's going to look at our solution if we say it's AI or ML and it's basically a marketing exercise, I mean, I don't know that any harm is being done there. But the thing is that as a practitioner, as a buyer, you need to understand, okay, these folks are, this is the problem they're trying to solve, and hopefully that I also need solved. And in these instances, this more sophisticated capability is necessary, but it's okay if, for in situations where it's not necessarily, like, okay, these guys said that to get people in the door, got it. All right, check, move on. Let's actually understand what it does.
Yeah. Well, and I think, I've talked to a lot of marketing heads at the different tech companies, and they're in a tough spot. They can be in a tough spot because you have to fit an industry category. RFPs just have all these things that if you say no to one, it's like, well, then you're off the consideration list. And it's like, well, but it's not even relevant to what we're trying to solve for, but we have to be able to say, so they're in a really tough space. And I think that's where, over the years, I've gotten to know the tech companies better. I have a lot more empathy for some of the challenges that they have to deal with to say, look, we've got to kind of do some of these things. Again, I think of back when degrees broke into the LXP category before that was a thing. Trying to explain what an LXP was when it wasn't a category. I mean, I remember Kelly and I just talking about how challenging it was to even get people to go, a what? That's not a nice category we can fit into our procurement process, because
we don't have a budget.
They don't get it. Right. We don't have budget for an LXP, whatever that is. We only have, and there's a lot that goes into that. So I think, this goes back to, and I think as practitioners, there's some responsibility, there's a lot of responsibility, which is where I think this conversation is really helpful, because it is about, you have to, if you hear in the trends that AI and machine learning are becoming a big thing, or immersive learning is becoming a big thing, and you go, I don't know what that is. That really is on you to say, I need to take the time and energy to figure out enough about it to be dangerous so that I can evaluate strategically whether this is important or not important. Doesn't mean I have to shift my priorities. Doesn't mean I need to move everything around, but it does mean I shouldn't be unable to have a business conversation about it intelligently. And if I don't, I just need to take the time to figure out, how do I get to that point?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And, there's always going to be something new, right? It's just like in the newspaper, right? You don't sell newspapers by not having some new thing that you need to be worried about. Like, it's just, that's the nature of the beast. And so, I think that some of what this is, like you said, looking at it and saying, okay, is this relevant to me? And then, the other component is just looking and saying, am I hearing this enough for me to think this is actually real? Like, and that is where there's benefit in looking at a lot of different sources. Because, if 5 or 6 or 7 of them are all saying whatever matters, then I think, that's probably an indication that it actually is a thing.
Right.
That said, there are I would say that research organizations are a little bit better, not just RedThread, but others as well, at identifying some of the edge cases coming sooner. So if I think that different practitioners have different level of comfort on where they sit in terms of my organization is just kind of standard middle of the road. We want to be aware of what's coming, but we're not going to be on the cutting edge. And other people are like, we are on the bleeding edge of what is coming and happening. And so, if your organization is more on that, looking at some of those different trends, and particularly from organizations that don't necessarily have something to sell, but maybe starting to see something or to sense something sooner, that's where those can be useful as well. So a lot of times, we'll write about things a year or two before they kind of hit the mainstream, if you will. And if you're on the cutting edge, that can be extremely helpful in seeing around corners.
Well, and I think everything we're getting back to just goes back to being informed and understanding what you're dealing with and knowing how to work with this stuff. Because again, I deal with a lot of practitioners who read the trend reports and they feel like we're so far behind. We're so far behind. And what we're talking about here is, no, you're not actually. I mean, that's designed to give you that North Star, that future cast of, okay, so in a couple years, maybe we should be kind of working towards that. Although it can be I think that's one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking about this. One of the cautions that I do sometimes see on the practitioner side is you can dismiss these trends. That's the other side. You do see the folks that kind of, I think, Kelly, you brought it up in the comments, shiny object syndrome. there's that where you can go, oh, this is the thing. Let's reprioritize everything to this stuff that our organization is 5 years from even being mature enough to consider. But you can be on the other side of that where you just dismiss all this stuff and go, yeah, we don't need to worry about that. We're over here. We're comfortable doing that. And I would say to folks on that end, this research can help you go, well, if everybody's talking about this and others are doing it and you're going, not us, you may want to reevaluate where you're at. And I think this gets tying back to what you said early in the conversation. Participating in this research and collaborating with people can be a really helpful way to figure out where you are on that spectrum. If you're in that peer group, that research group that you're hosting on the next thing, and 9 of the people in there are saying, yeah, we're starting to explore this, we're doing it here and there, and you're going, we haven't even talked about this. It may be time to say, well, you may need to start having that conversation.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is it's very easy to be dismissive of things that at first blush look really hard. And yet there can often be simpler fixes than what other people are doing. Or ways to inch up on it in, either through small process change or through pilots in a small part of the organization that is interested in this type of work. So like an example for me is performance management. I know I mentioned that we've got a study coming out on that, but I've been writing about performance management for a long time, more than a decade.
For a while.
And when we first started talking about moving away from a rigid once a year approach,
I remember this trend. It was like everybody was on the kill the performance review train bandwagon.
Everyone was, and that wasn't at the time. Like I was like, well, you could, but that's a little bit skeptical of, but it certainly wasn't the solution for every organization. Let's just say that, right? But
very political way to put it.
But we did need to change performance management.
We did,
right? And so like you didn't have to be on the kill the performance review side of things to be like, okay, well, is it completely crazy that we're only making sure our managers are talking to employees once a year? Yes, like just like as a human being, that's a terrible idea. So what might we do that is a small step in moving, towards not doing that? And, it just is an incremental process. It could be okay. Set an expectation that you have a quarterly check-in where you talk about performance. Like that is a big process change, but that can make a big impact in the organization. And so, you don't have to kill the performance review to make performance management better than it was, for sure.
Well, and I have a follow-up question on this, but I think, and this is where, as practitioners, taking time to reflect on what's being said underneath what's being said is really helpful. Because I remember when that trend was going big and it was like, we need down with the performance review. We're stripping them. I was in organizations and helping some organizations in a similar, and they're like, we got to get rid of it. How do we get rid of the performance review? And I remember being like, how are you going to evaluate anyone's performance if you have 0 data points anywhere? And when you really dug into the problem, it was, well, people aren't talking to their managers other than once a year. And it was like, okay, so that's the problem. The problem is managers are kind of ignoring conversations till this year-end thing. And I think that's the point you're bringing up is, well, you don't have to kill the performance review to address that, but you can say, all right, what are some steps we can do to encourage more frequent check-ins between a leader and their direct reports, which, I mean, this is organizational change. I mean, this is significant stuff. So I am curious with this, without spoiling the whole research report, because this is a topic that's very close to mind right now for me. I've been in a lot of discussions on it because this is getting back to the behavior. What would we really like to see as an organization in terms of this? And when do we formalize that into a performance review? And when do we say, we're not going to formalize it? What's happening with performance management? And then, Brian, I will come back to your question because you know what? Let's table this for 1 second because I will forget Brian's question if I don't. The other question, going back to research, and then we're going to go to this performance management, is, do you have any suggestions before we kind of shift off of kind of the how to use research, things like that, on how do you recommend people evaluate research? We really talked about the value of kind of having that breadth of different research, understanding there's some underpinnings behind it. But if you aren't as familiar with the inner workings of some of that, are there any things that you've seen that you can kind of recommend to folks to kind of say, hey, here's not a watch out as in now throw this research out, but hey, this is kind of an indicator that you may want to consider carefully or consider it through this lens if you're doing that. So, you know, is this unbiased? Is there a bias bend to it? Things like that.
Yeah. So I would start with making sure you look at the methodology. And if there is no methodology, that's a red flag. So
then calling it research is actually kind of, a stretch of the word.
Yeah. So it's actually somewhat terrifying how many people don't share any information on what they do. And like, there's different levels, right? Because I could geek out on this stuff for a very long time, and yet I recognize that most people do not care. But you should be in the group that at least somewhat minimally cares, meaning that you should go find the methodology. You should understand, for instance, if it's a survey piece of survey work, who was surveyed, over what time frame were they surveyed, a general sense, if possible, of what the breakdown was of the population, like is it actually representative, and what was the size of the sample. So, you know, just as a very like rough number for y'all, if you're trying to say that something is representative within the United States, that the minimum N should be 370. That's just like a statistical break point. So
370 what? People, organizations, like
so organizations.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So it should be 170 organizations. Often what happens with samples is that they're roughly equivalent. Like for instance, in our data sets, we rarely have multiple people from the same organization taking a survey. Not that we don't ever, but it's a good point. You know, what is the number of organizations? So that would be the thing I'd be looking for. And then look at the questions, or even if you don't have the actual questions listed, if you see the data, think to yourself, okay, what's the question they had to ask to get to this? Because, you know, if the question is, you know, which immersive technology do you like best, right? Like and you know, there's these options, and then it's like, you know, and then they're like, you know, whatever, 70% of people love, you know, this type of immersive technology, and it's like, well, there wasn't even like a question before that, which is like, do you think immersive technology is good or important, or, you know, but like, you know, so language gets twisted to serve somebody's point in an argument, which is the paper. And so sometimes saying, okay, is this what these data actually are saying, or are they maybe just changing the way that they're presenting this information? So read it critically would be my suggestion.
Well, those I think are really, and again, you see this where you'll see latest industry report, and again, you don't have to be a complete analyst geek to care about some of this stuff. But I've seen it where you go, well, I mean, what even, like, how many people were included? And you'll scroll down and like on the very bottom in the fine print, it's like 20 people surveyed in, you know, this. And you're like, that's not necessarily representative of a very broad spectrum of people to be saying this is a trend type of a thing. So I think that kind of digging into it. And I love the kind of reverse engineering, which is kind of what we were talking about with the performance management thing, where it's like, what problem were we really trying to get to that these responses or these results came out of this? Because if you know, it wasn't really clear, like you said, you were leading the horse, which we don't need to go down this path because then we'll get too far. But I mean, even question design and all of this, which we see in culture assessments and things like this. If your culture scorecard is only asking like, how much do you love working at this company? A lot, a ton. You're like,
exactly.
Wow, everybody loves working here. Well, you technically only ask them how much they love working here. So what choice did they even have? Or even, you know, the framing of it made it pretty clear that you don't want to be the person that says, I don't I don't love working here type of a thing.
This isn't really my favorite place. Oh, that wasn't one of the options.
Oh, that wasn't one of the options. Okay, well, I guess I'll pick not applicable, and then my data's not included in that. So I think those are some good considerations for folks as you're looking at that. And without getting into the details of it, I mean, the last 2 years has exposed how vulnerable people are to taking kind of the headlines without doing the due diligence that you said, to say, hey, like, let's actually dig a little bit deeper into where is this research coming from, or what is actually this being based on, and how is this headline being created? Is it being created from things like that? So I think it's a really good call out for that. Okay, so let's shift back to this performance management. And if you think of anything else on that one, but I think those are two really good tips that anybody looking at a research report, that's a simple action you can take. Look at the methodology without getting, you don't have to even get too geeky on it. And then actually look at the questions and say, what questions were asked, or what questions might have been asked to try and get these responses, type of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
So on this performance management one, I am curious, because this does have impact. Some people might go, well, what does that have to do with learning? Well, it has a lot to do with learning when you think about this is how leaders are engaging with their people, which ties to leadership development, which ties to organizational I mean, this ties to a lot of different things. Where are things shifting right now, with people's, and I think this ties to the hybrid work thing as well, because you think about all of a sudden managers were left with a distributed workforce. They weren't really sure how to connect with their people. This ties to a lot of stuff. So what is coming out of that in terms of where orgs are at today?
Yeah, so this is a study that we did where we actually have longitudinal data, which is super exciting, because we did a survey in, what was it? Say October of 2019. So generally pretty close to before the pandemic. We then surveyed in October of 2020, and then we surveyed in October of 2021. So we're able to
right through the thick of it.
Yeah, right through the thick of it, which is pretty cool. So some of what we're seeing is, one, a shift in the purpose around performance management. So when we asked in 2019, why do you do performance management? It was like, well, to evaluate employees. Like, that was the top reason. And then what has actually happened over the course of the pandemic is, instead, people are saying their top reason is to enable productivity and to enable engagement. So a fundamental kind of shift in the way that people are looking at the intention of it is one thing. A second thing that we saw was that organizations are increasingly getting better at communicating around goals and the importance of goals and keeping them up to date. And one thing that was really interesting, it may seem like a small shift, but I don't think it is, was in 2019, when we asked about goals were like a manager thing. So it was, hey, Christopher, like, you go set some goals with your employees, and like, you guys go do your thing, and awesome, that's great. And like, the organization said you should do it, but like, if you didn't do it, whatever. Right? I mean, not totally whatever, but it wasn't really like
no, but a little more of a haphazard, kind of siloed. We're not too concerned about it. Make sure that you do your thing, so we have something to manage performance against.
Exactly. Whereas now what we've seen, particularly to your point around the workforce was so distributed, is like, if you don't know what the goals are, you probably don't actually know what your people are working on. And so it shifted to much more of an organizational thing. Like, organizations are much more embedded in the goal setting process, much more on top of it, and making sure that those things are happening, and making sure that those goal related conversations are happening. So it shifted from kind of an individual thing to a system thing, if you will, which I think is actually a great development. It's like what we've been trying to get people to do for years. So that was a good thing. And then the other thing, and this is actually going to be coming out in the report, will be published in a few weeks, is when we looked at kind of what makes performance management work. Before, we talked about culture, capability of managers, and then clarity as kind of these three different concepts. Now in this new study, clarity, which was around goals, actually got rolled into culture. So it's more of an organizational thing. And then the third, and we do still have a third C, but that third C is connection. And so the idea that part of performance management in these conversations really is to connect people to the organization, which makes sense when you think about, the distributed nature of what we've been doing.
Yeah.
Like you need to feel that connection. And within connection, there's an element of, actually, I think there's some capability managers, but there's an element of care that wasn't there in the data before. So we're shifting more from this we're here to evaluate performance and that's what we do, to instead we're trying to engage, we're trying to help you be more protective, and we're trying to make sure that you feel connected to the organization.
So what's really interesting about this, and this is where I personally, I think it's easy to get caught in your functional silo. So, I'm a learning leader, so I look at learning trends and learning tech trends. And I actually spend just as much, if not more time, looking at the broader talent and organizational trends that are happening. Because even just as you're talking through this has direct implications to really, if you're trying to be a forward-thinking learning organization, everything you just said actually should be impacting what you're doing from a learning standpoint. Because this is actually a fundamental shift in the way organizations are thinking about their people, which is they need to be connected to a bigger picture. They need to have greater clarity, and they need to feel more connected to one another, which when you think about what learning and development and talent development is designed to do, it's those three things. And historically, we've either struggled to do that well, or we've tried and the organization really didn't have the appetite. It was like, whatever. That's fine and dandy, but we have work to get done. And I think this is where we're seeing organizations fundamentally shift the way they're prioritizing and thinking about things. And I've seen L&D orgs go, they've kind of gotten this beaten out of them where they're like, we've tried this and nobody would listen. And I'm actually seeing a resurgence of the companies now asking for this. And I'm seeing sometimes L&D people go, you know what, we're not there. We've tried this before. It doesn't work. And it's like, no, the actual organization is shifting its whole thing on the relationships, and learning's tied to this. If you've got an L&D initiative that is not tied to the bigger, and I think this is where the skills discussion is coming in. Mm-hmm. Why am I developing these skills? We keep telling people you need to reskill and upskill and this and that, and they're like, why? Like, I don't care. Like, this feels exhausting to me. And it's because a lot of times we're not connecting this back to, because fundamentally, organizationally, we're going here. And this is the change in our business that's going here. And as a result, you are going to be here, and doing that requires you to be, all of this threads together very, very, very well. So it's interesting hearing, this is how fundamentally organizations are changing the way they think about their workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are. And I think that this reflects also a shift in how we expect to get, to just engage with people and the experience that they're having at work. I think, you look at how many people are, becoming contractors or going into the gig economy, and you look at the gap in the talent that we have, and we look at the Great Resignation, and it's like, we as organizations have to some extent go from being the hammer. If you think about traditional performance management, it was a hammer. You either met the standard or you didn't, and like you didn't, out you go. But
it was the Jack Welch way of doing things for a long time. He said it.
Yeah, but like, can't, because a lot of people, like, here's kind of an anecdote, but I think it illustrates the point well. I have a friend who is in-house counsel at a company that actually just recently IPO'd, and she was doing great work. Like, she was fully responsible for getting this IPO off the ground from the legal perspective, et cetera. And she goes into her performance review, and her manager actually gave her like the one below meets expectations, and she was like, what? Like, I am like driving this thing. She's like, well, you didn't like do these two things like that, and she and she was like,
it happens.
Yeah, it happens, right? And 2 days later, she's like, I'm out. And then they were like, oh, well, will you come back and consult? Like, oh, no, actually, you're really valuable, and it's like, no, actually, I've got better options. And she like went out and she started her own consulting thing, like helping these types of companies IPO, and she's doing fabulously. And but that is the reality, right? Think of how that conversation could have been different around, like, back to your point around needs and development and care and connection, like, you're doing this stuff really well. Here's some areas we'd like to see you. And this may have been a situation where having no score performance review could have been a good thing.
Could have been. Well, but even if it had gone back to more conversations and informal things where, hey, these two things, you're not delivering on them. So at least there's awareness of like, oh, I didn't know, or here's why I'm not, because I'm prioritizing these. Like, oh, okay, never mind. You wouldn't have got into that conversation and gone, doesn't meet expectations. Like, are you out of your mind type of a thing? Because that's hard to come back from.
Right. And like in this situation, there was no coming back. But exactly, because she's like, I'm prioritizing the IPO and the things that go in front of the board. So no, I did not do these two minor things. Like, but it, when it feels like the hammer's out or the pitchfork's out for you as an employee, and that's what you get in performance management, that's not gonna, people aren't gonna stay. And they have
no, they won't.
So, so that's why you have to think about it differently, right? You can't just be thinking about it as evaluation. And that's what we're seeing in the data. So if your organization is just thinking about it that way, you need to be reflecting on what that's actually going to do for folks.
Well, and I think there's two things that came out of that, this little kind of snippet is this one, this shift to organizations are starting to recognize, and Kelly, you brought up a good point that she moved over into talent management, and organizations are recognizing that employees, this connection across the entire employee piece is so critical. You can't treat them one way here and then differently here and differently here. It's like, this is all interconnected. The way we recruit people has to tie to the way we develop people, and the way we develop people has to tie to the way we do performance and the way we do organizational planning. And I mean, everything is so interconnected because at the end of the day, they're all people, and I keep using the word thread, which is ironic given I'm with RedThread, but there is a thread that connects all this stuff together. And I think organizations are waking up to that going, oh, we've kind of just been treating this as a tactical list of like, well, there's a fire over here. Let's put out that fire. There's a fire. And it's like, well, that fire started because of this fire, which is tied to this fire. And you're literally just running around putting this out. And I think the other thing that that came to mind as you were thinking, as you were talking about this is, this is an area that we have a lot of opportunity to influence right now. Mm-hmm. Like we really can, with some of the things that are happening in our organizations, as we think about the conversations we're having, as we're thinking about, we've talked in learning about wanting a seat at the table. I hate that phrase, but realistically, organizations are saying, hey, you could have one. It's here now. And this stuff isn't, I am curious your take on this, because we will run out of time. We aren't even chipping the surface, but some of this stuff isn't new. And one of the things that came to mind as we were talking about this, I remember when the gig economy talk, this was way before the pandemic. People were talking about the gig economy picking up and all of this, which was this leading indicator that people were starting to wake up to this. I don't really like working in a place where I feel like I'm not really appreciated. I don't really understand they were kind of starting to wake up to this. I don't really want to do this anymore. But there wasn't necessarily the kerosene on the fire that pushed it just boom. And then the pandemic hit and all this stuff that people just went, you know what? Forget this. I mean, I've been killing myself for whatever. I've had zero flexibility. I've, not been appreciated. Now I'm proving that I can do all this. I'm not going to put up with this. And I think had some organizations been paying attention to some of these trends early on, saying, why is the gig economy really starting to gain steam? Why are more people willing to take risk? Well, it's because they're realizing that the risk of being at a full-time job isn't really more safe than consult. They're realizing that, all these things that they could have maybe got in front of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And this goes back to our earlier conversation about just thinking through what's at the root of whatever the question is, or the challenge is, or the trend is that you're seeing, understanding, okay, like, these things are happening. So, to your point on, if you were to apply that to right now, and we think about return to office and, the desire for flexibility, like what is underneath that? I think there's a lot of things underneath that, but as an example, people realize they weren't seeing their kids. People realize now they've had 2 years with their kids, and they're like, oh wait, maybe
right. I actually kind of like being around my spouse and my children. I kind of forgot about that.
Or the number of people who are like, oh, like I actually am now exercising regularly because I'm not commuting, or whatever it is. But think about what is driving this thing, and what is driving this thing in your organization. And if you don't know the answer to that, there's all sorts of awesome employee listening technologies out there, and that's another report that we have coming out that can help you understand that. But whatever the big trend is, ask, why is that happening, and why might that be happening in my organization?
Yeah. Well, and what's funny about this is with the pandemic, I remember when it first hit and everybody suddenly got thrown, remote. I remember going, you just wait 2 years from now, everybody's going to be freaking out about return to office because the employees are going to go, well, wait a minute now. I don't know that I really, it was like, you could almost just see 3 years in advance of, oh, this is going to, and I see now, organizations to some degree maybe focusing on the wrong problem, because now they're like, well, do we go back to the office or do we go remote? And it's like, you're asking the wrong question. You're not listening to why is it people are struggling, because the reality is you talk to some people and they realize they didn't really have social connections outside of work. And so then this loneliness trend is blowing up, and you're like, okay, but do we solve loneliness by forcing everybody into a conference room? Like, I don't know that that's necessarily the right. And I think this gets really, really complicated, really, really fast. But there are some ways where you can look at those leading indicators to go, okay, rather than waiting till the fire blows up and we have to try and solve for it, look at those ahead of time, which I think this is what we've been talking about with the research. It can be extremely helpful in doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely right that people are asking the wrong question when it comes to return to office. We are doing a podcast series right now on hybrid. And we have we led off with John Boudreau, who just published a book on Work Without Jobs. And, and then we did, we've dropped one with Don Klinghoffer of Microsoft, who's done a ton of work in this space. We've got RJ Milner from Uber, who will drop next week. And then actually Michael Arena, who was with AWS until 2 weeks ago, when he decided to pull the gig worker cord and jump out. But I would say the headline from all of these conversations we've been having is, it's not about the policy of 2 or 3 days in the office. It's about what is the work that needs to get done, and where can that work happen best, and by whom? And that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about what needs to happen. But if we're able to do that, we're both going to have, the benefits of remote work and the experience that we had just now, with the opportunity for connection and, whiteboarding and coming up with ideas together. But if you, to your point, if you force everyone to get into a conference room and you're like, okay, like, why are we here? So that we can be friends? Like, I like friends. I have a lot of them.
I know. I have a lot of them. I don't necessarily.
So is that really why we're going to a conference room? Like,
no,
that doesn't make much sense.
Well, and I think, and again, we'll wrap this, but I mean, I just even think of this skills conversation, because one of the things I think that's coming with this is, as people start to better recognize what their skills are and what their value is, suddenly doing the job that is only 10% of the skills that they really bring to the table, suddenly they're like, I don't know that this really works for me, which is what we're seeing with the Great Resignation, where they're going, I would rather use that 10%, 80%. And I don't know if I can do that here. I mean, there's a lot of this stuff that's going to come crashing down around us, that we have opportunity, I think, for organizations to build up things to be prepared for it. So again, anybody who's not following RedThread, I would really encourage it, because this is an opportunity to get in front of some of these things, find people to have these conversations with, because they really can be helpful in being more predictive in where we need to go. Because you can, when you start getting into it, I don't know about you, but I feel like you can start to read the tea leaves a little bit better, where you go, oh, I see what's on the horizon, and this is coming for us if we're not ready for it.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's what you get from, just making sure you stay on top of what's happening in the industry. So thank you.
All right. Yes. Well, Stacia, it has been a pleasure, as I knew it would be. Thanks for making the time. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Hopefully, this just gave you some different insights on how to think about research, how to get in front of some of these trends, and what some of these trends are and what they may mean for the work we do, because there is a lot to unpack here. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your Thursday and a great week. Safe travels to you, Stacia, in the rest of your weekend. Well, actually, over the coming weeks. Say hi to Danny for me when you get together in person.
I will. Thank you. And thanks to everybody for listening today.